Well, hello, Ben.
Hey, Gary.
I'm only here because I'm a Houstonian like Ben, and like Ben, in my career, I sort of mentally transported myself as far away as I could imagine, which was Europe. And unlike Ben, I didn't move permanently to Europe, which you did in 2002. But we have a similar formation, even if we're a generation apart. And so we have many things to share, including a love of European paintings. And we're here today to talk about Ben's latest book, The World Upside Down, which in part is about European painting, and specifically Dutch painting of the Golden Age, which is to say the 17th century. But it's primarily a book about Ben and how he thinks and how he feels. So Ben, do we have some slides?
We do have some slides. Are they coming up? We don't need the slides if they're not. Do you have them? No? Okay, well, I guess we don't have them. I thank you. It's fun to see you here because the last time, Gary and I saw each other in Amsterdam, but before that, when my book came out, we were in Houston talking together, our hometown, and it was really fun to be back in, I don't know if Gary would call it Gary's museum, but Gary is the boss of this museum where I grew up going and my first encounters with art, and my first encounters with a kind of other reality that art offers. And I did go pretty deep into this when my life path, took me to live in the Netherlands and spend now most of my life abroad, which is a funny thing. I mean, I'm 48, and I've now spent more of my life in another country than in my own country. But I think that when I got to the Netherlands, I think whenever you go to a country, there's something that impresses you in a hugely, maybe not every country. I mean, I'm here in India, which is such an overwhelmingly artistic country, and you feel like everybody is doing something artistic. It's similar in the Netherlands in the Golden Age, where you had these people who were not just one great artist, but this entire constellation of people. And I was absolutely ravished by this art, and I didn't really know where to start looking at it. And when you go into the museums, sometimes there's a great figure, sometimes there's, I think all great figures come out of a series of figures. So Shakespeare, we all know Shakespeare, but in fact, around Shakespeare, there's a whole theatrical world, there's a whole royal court, there's a whole economic system, there's all these other poets and writers. And so in the case of the Netherlands, the great figure is Rembrandt. And Rembrandt, unlike almost all the other painters, we know a lot about Rembrandt. Shakespeare also we know almost nothing about. There's hundreds of books about Shakespeare based on really almost nothing. So I started learning about Rembrandt and feeling quite close to him because there's so much about him that we can actually see, which is, and it's the only one, really.
Well, in your book, you, I think, hit upon all the great painters of the Golden Age, the landscape painters, the figurative painters. And I think for most of us, Rembrandt and Vermeer epitomize the greatest of the figurative painters of the Golden Age. And yet they couldn't be more different in the way they look at the world and in the way they realize their art. So why don't you speak a little bit about your thoughts about those two artists, what they mean to you and what they mean to the Netherlands?
Well, it's almost a royal genealogy. It goes from Rembrandt, who's a little bit earlier, and then the mystery of Dutch art history when it starts becoming scientifically examined in the 19th century was how do you get from Rembrandt to Vermeer? And I was very interested in these figures that come between them. Rembrandt had a huge school, a studio where he had at least dozens and perhaps even hundreds of students over the course of his career. And all of them sort of start out imitating him, and some of them keep imitating him, and some of them don't. And the ones who do, in this very religiously informed art history in the 19th century, they were called apostles, they were called followers, but in a sort of saintly way. These were people who, and if you didn't do it, if you didn't do exactly as the master did, you were seen as unfaithful, almost like a religious apostate. And these figures really fascinated me. And as you start looking at them, their personalities, which they have to repress because of this criterion of fidelity, this criterion that the person who does it exactly as the other person is the correct way. And so it becomes very hard for these people to assert their own personalities. And when you get to Vermeer, you you lose this trace. Because as you say, you get to this very different personality, but we do know, and Vermeer is a great example of someone we know almost nothing about. I mean, there's been almost, 150 years of art historians digging through the yellow papers with the crazy handwriting. And I say the crazy handwriting because I got to go last year to see the original documents that describe the third great artist of the Golden Age, which is Franz Hals. It was for a film that we were making in Germany. And we got to get these books out and read it. And 17th century Dutch handwriting is absolutely impossible to read in a way that you think, okay, this can't be that hard. It says Franz Hals, right? It's hopeless. I mean, if you don't actually go to graduate school, you're never going to get it. But people have spent now 150 years going through this and trying to reconstruct these lives, and Vermeer is the great mystery of the Dutch painters, because he's the greatest of besides Rembrandt, he's the greatest painter, but he's also, there's nothing about him that we can know.
Well, we know he had a rich wife, and he had a number of daughters, that he was selling paintings out of his house.
Yeah.
And he left this oeuvre of, depending on how you count, 36, 38, 39 paintings.
Yeah, and knowing he has a rich wife, how far does that get you? Because the whole point of Vermeer is that he's mysterious, not only as a figure, but these paintings make you want to get closer to somebody because they're so beautiful and they're so alluring and they're rare. And you get these glimpses, so there's almost a seduction of somebody who's letting you see just a little tiny corner of their, like in the 19th century novel, when the men would see a woman's ankle, and that was like this huge turn on. With Vermeer, it's like, oh, you find a receipt, like he bought 3 loaves of bread, and the art historian gets really excited about this. But the thing about it is that when I was writing this book, I thought what was interesting about it when I was a young person, I mean, it's not what was interesting about it. One of the things that's interesting about it is that I was also on this journey of trying to figure out what it meant to do something. So do you have to be original? Because actually a lot of cultures, if you go to Egypt, how long do they maintain the same style, exactly the same style, for thousands of years?
Thousands, yeah.
Their values are not our values. Our values are of originality. The artist is supposed to have this personality that's, nobody can miss it. And the Egyptians didn't. That would have been impious and ridiculous, probably. And you would have not had a job if you decided to express yourself. And so, yeah.
Yeah, but I want to talk about this duality. I mean, we can bring in Franz Hals, and I know you've been thinking about Hals as well. But I look at the icy, glacial perfection of Vermeer, and the difficulty of interpreting what his pictures mean. I mean, we can project anything we want onto them, but they're so perfect and also based on very strict geometry, which is part of their perfection, and also I think creates a kind of boundary between us and the picture, versus the extraordinary emotive quality of Rembrandt. So to me, there you have the pole. I mean, you have, with Franz Hals, you have the virtuosic brushwork, which is really spectacular, but you don't know much about the people underneath all those brushstrokes. Nor with Vermeer, but it's all perfection and geometry and glacial. But with Rembrandt, you have constant emotion, exactly.
It's just somebody letting it all hang out, as we say. I mean, he's an incredibly emotional person, and we know that he actually was a quite as I would say now, a problematic person. I mean, he had these terrible relationships with his family and with his lovers. But you say Vermeer was perfect, and this is what I, as a young person trying to become a writer and trying to figure out what I was doing, I loved the bad Vermeers. And everybody thinks of bad Vermeer because, you know, they're so few and they're so perfect, but there's a few that are really weird looking. And as a biographer, I've written books about writers and about artists, and I always liked the bad stuff. Because when you're going through someone's life, first of all, you know that a lot of good stuff comes out of bad stuff. You know, you make a mistake and you learn from it. If you're somebody who's a real artist, you'll take a risk and it's not so great, and then you learn and you do something else. But also as a young person, you know, looking at this culture and trying to understand what I was doing, because it's really quite scary to become a writer, or I think any kind of artist. It's not really advisable. I don't know.
Well, we have an entire festival of writers.
We have,
here.
exactly.
Yeah.
But it's something that it is, you know, your parents are right to think, you know, maybe go work at the bank or something stable, you know? And so it was very reassuring to me that even these great figures could have flaws. I found that very comforting.
So where can we find Dutch culture is it Rembrandt? Is it Vermeer? Is it Frans Hals? Is it surface brilliance? Is it icy perfection? Is it, you know, these strong human emotions?
Well, I think that it's, what I loved about writing this book is that it's all of the above. And the thing about the Dutch, it's not just one figure. It's this whole range of people, and some of them are very messy, including Rembrandt. And some of them, so if you're a young person trying to learn about the world and trying to learn about art and trying to learn about philosophy visually, you have this whole range of people. And I think that the Dutch world of the 17th century is so fascinating because it's so cosmopolitan. And so you have, actually there's one Dutch artist, in fact a Flemish artist, who dies in Goa. But he went on an embassy to the Persian Empire, Michael Sweerts, and he loses his mind, and they finally get him to India, and he dies in Goa. But actually, India is not really a big part of the Dutch world, but Japan is, China is, Africa is, Latin America is, New York is a Dutch city. And so I found it, I'm from a big country, and it's quite a strange thing if you're from a big country to find yourself in a small country, because it really feels small. And you realize, like if I live in the United States, if I live in New York, I'm not really thinking about Idaho very much. But in fact, when you lose Idaho, you feel constricted, you know.
There goes the French fries.
Yeah.
Right.
And you know, it's something really, it gave me back a sense of space, this Dutch world, and really understanding how big it was.
Well, let's speak for a minute about this larger Dutch world and this phenomenon which I think is unparalleled in European art history until the end of the 19th century, when there's an international art market which is sustaining a number of artists creating constantly. But before that, the only other incident I can think of in European art is the Dutch Golden Age, when tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of paintings were created, and writers from other countries were astonished to find that poor farmers would have 4 paintings in their house with the cows, sitting in the living room because they needed them for warmth, and yet there were paintings on the wall. Tell us about what fueled all of that.
Well, a lot of this cosmopolitanism that we're talking about and the extraordinary wealth that comes into this small country. Holland in the Golden Age is only 1 million people. And considering...
How many million?
1 million.
Yeah.
At the height of the Golden Age, during the life of Rembrandt, it's 1 million people. And I find this totally thrilling because there's very few of these moments in history where a city or a country has a Golden Age, in fact. So you think about Florence, in the Renaissance, or you think about ancient Greece, or there's moments in other cultures where it all explodes, because mostly it doesn't. You have people working in this way. But the Dutch liked art, and they still do. And it's funny because I'm here with a friend who's here in India for the first time, and I was trying to explain how Indians like jewelry, for example. You can wear clothes and colors and textiles in India that you couldn't wear in other countries. Because Indians, it's just a taste. And the Dutch have a taste for paintings, and they still do. I mean, you go into Dutch houses, sometimes it goes horribly wrong. I mean, this is sad. But often, really regular Dutch people, they can't afford paintings from the Golden Age, but they do support artists. They do like art in a way that for Americans is a bit, it's just not our culture as much. And so it's a mystery, again, how this happens in history.
Right. Well, it starts with money. Yeah. And we can look at the Spanish Golden Age, but I mean, the great painters, Murillo, Velázquez, et cetera, coming into Seville, which was the source of all the wealth coming from the Americas, starting in 1492 and into the early, all the way into the 17th century. But there wasn't a mercantile class, there wasn't a middle class to patronize because of the extraordinary inequity in Spanish society, which was different. There were huge inequities in Dutch society, but there was this very large middle class out of this million people who could indulge a taste for painting, and it became a status symbol among themselves.
Yeah, and they also, the difference between the Spanish and the Dutch is also that the Dutch got rid of all the art in the churches, and they didn't have a royal family. They had aristocratic families, but they didn't have, like in Spain, where you had one court. Actually, Jaipur sort of looks like what Seville or Madrid would have looked like. You have a huge palace with the Maharaja, and they sustain thousands of artisans, cooks, painters, architects, astronomers, but it's all focused. Whereas in Holland, they get rid of that in their revolution in the 17th century, and so it becomes democratized. Again, it's not saying democratize, it's a very, by our standards now, it's a shockingly poor country. Shockingly poor. I mean, I think probably 2/3 of the people in my book die before 40. The amount of disease, the amount of accidents that you could get into with just, things that now you would take one pill and it would be over. In those days, dead. And but there was this large mercantile class, and they loved this stuff. The Germans had a similar kind of, in certain parts of Germany and they weren't that interested in art. The Dutch, and they still are. So there's a real continuity to it. It's quite a wonderful part of living there.
And here we are in India, and India was a huge participant in global trade in this era, of course. And so we have to acknowledge where the wealth that entered the Netherlands was often through exploitations in Brazil, in Indonesia. Not only colonies were they making, but they certainly were exploiting natural resources around the globe, and that enabled the wealth to come to Holland and pay the painters for these works of art.
Absolutely, and it was a brutal, brutal society. But what was interesting, there's a painting by Metsu in my book, Gabriel Metsu, who also dies, I think, 37, 36, of this very wealthy family. And these are some of the richest people, not only in Holland, but in the whole world. And they're extremely posh, and they're posing with all their jewels and all their houses and everything. And then I went through this painting and saw what happened to these people in this family. And the death, within 2 or 3 years, all the children died, the wife died. It's actually quite terrifying that on a global perspective, that's true, but in individual lives, it was a brutal, brutal society.
Yeah, and we speak of Dutch tolerance, and compared, let's say, to Spain or even the Spanish Netherlands, the Spanish lowlands, it was remarkably tolerant of other cultures, other faiths, other people, but all within certain very strong boundaries. So
that's right.
Right.
And they didn't really want to be tolerant. It's almost like India in the sense, like, if you decided there's just going to be one religion in India, it just wouldn't work. You could want that, but when the Catholic Church breaks up in the Reformation, starting in the 16th century, there come to be so many sects that actually there's not really a majority of anything. And what's great about that for artists and for writers is that it's like cracks in the pavement. All these plants can come up in all these different places, and it creates something where any kind of hegemonic style is impossible, even philosophy. And so it becomes a very rich side. But as in our country, in the United States, people are always trying to repress dissident religions, dissident sexualities, dissident races, dissident religions. I mean, they're very, Americans have been at that since the Salem witch trials, but it just doesn't work, and it does give the society a real creative possibility.
So how did you find yourself? Because to me, the book is more about you than it is about Dutch painting. How did you find it how did you, in a sense, reveal yourself to yourself through your study of Dutch culture? Well,
I mean, I think theoretically, I like the idea of indirection. So I like talking about certain questions that I have. So I have, 16 or 17 painters, something like that. That's my choice. I do try to hit all the big names, but it's my choice, and I could take this or the other, but I think I was interested in taking the ones that illustrated some question that I was interested in. So this question of what does it mean to be original? What does it mean to be a follower? What does it mean to succeed, and what does it mean to fail? Because actually I wrote this book over 20 years, in which I started off as a total nobody. I was a kid when I came to Holland. And then I had all this sort of unexpected professional success, which is just in a way as disorienting. Because then, once you are known for something, then people expect you to produce the same thing, right? So if you're a landscape painter and you start painting portraits, nobody wants your portraits. They want the same thing you've already done. And so it's all these questions that I found, maybe it's my febrile imagination, but I found these painters from hundreds of years ago were actually thinking about the same questions and confronting the same barriers as I was.
So how to be an artist, how to produce cultural product, and how to find an audience for it, or a patronage for it. So I can see that on a professional level. How about on a philosophical level? How did you find yourself in Dutch culture and in its expression in Dutch painting?
Well, I think as an American, we tend to think that the Dutch are quite close to us, because they kind of look like Americans in a certain way. They look like the English. They're this sort of northern merchant culture. And I think that a lot of the ideas philosophically, or maybe even politically, that I came to through it was a sense of how fragile the society was and how much had to be fought for and how difficult it was to keep it once they had it. And for me, I'm not sure if this is what you're asking about philosophically, but I felt quite close to these people, and I also tried to not feel too close, because the temptation to over-identify is big because there's no information about them. So if you think I love neckties or something, you can find a necktie and then write a whole book about that, and people have done that. Dutch culture, you can project yourself into it very easily. But I was just always trying to keep both the closeness and the distance.
Well, I think that Dutch painting is a good source for humanistic, or case study for humanistic analysis, because so much of it is materialistic and realistic in the sense that it describes the natural world, through landscape and still life, etc. And it constantly depicting human emotions in a very direct way. And so we can learn how people in the 17th century dressed, kept their house, cooked their food, what kind of animals and pets they had, where the pets lounged during the day, how people made their bed or didn't make their bed, where their slippers were put or not put, and all the symbolism that. So I think it's a marvelous case study of entry into a society, because They liked to depict their lives, their animals. This is my prize cow.
Right.
And I'm going to commission a painting of it, and I'm going to hang it over the fireplace because this is my most prized possession. Or this is my wife, or this is my land, this is my house, or here's the ideal way to keep a house. Here's the maid, here are the children, here's the governess, here's the lesson, here's the toy in the corner that the child
Everybody's very clean.
Right, yeah, they're always cleaning, exactly, they're very clean. So I can see that, and we can contrast that to Spanish painting, which is deeply involved with the church and theology, and saints and mysterious events. We can look at French painting of the same period. It's difficult to understand France through contemporaries like Claude Lorrain or Nicolas Poussin. One is painting the gods. The other is ethereal landscapes that never existed with small, figures that are traipsing through these idealistic landscapes. With Dutch painting, you can be grounded and imagine that this was a reflection of reality, but in fact it wasn't.
Well, this is, I regret that our slideshow did not make it, because I wanted to show exactly this, which is that you see from the end of the medieval age, actually it's quite similar to Indian painting that you would have in a place like Jaipur, where you have a kind of ideal world, which is mainly concerned with religion, with the lives of the royal families or the aristocrats, and that's done in a very specific and very stylized way. Whereas with the Dutch, you see as you go forward in history, you see more and more quote unquote reality coming through. So you see a normal woman with her child. You see a farm. You see a cow. And you can think, oh, I have a dog. They had a dog. They're just like me. But the funny thing about studying art is that you realize how fake it is. And that actually making it look real, in fact, is a way of emphasizing how artificial it is. Because to show a perspective, for example, to show a picture in a rectangle, we're so used to this because we're used to photography. So you take out your phone and boom, there's the world, and everybody's arranged. If you're on the front row, you're on the front row, and then you're a little small. And this is very natural to us, but in fact, it's an intellectual, it's completely fake. And so I like fakeness that makes you work harder to see what the artist is doing and how the artist is creating an illusion of reality. And the Dutch do this, and when you realize how artificial it is, it becomes, to me at least, all the more fascinating and all the more mysterious and all the more distant. Because I don't think I'm in an angel with, with Jesus or something in heaven. Like that looks obviously not real to me. But like, a mother and a child or a dog, I mean, that looks okay. And then you learn how strange it is.
Yeah. So I think it is, a remarkable aspect of Dutch painting is that it gives us such insight into that culture. How it was and how it wasn't, because, as art historians, we can find the cracks in the facade and understand how things were. We can try to decode the symbolism that has escaped us today, but which was prevalent then, to understand that a pair of slippers next to a bed was emblematic
That's
of
about sex,
right,
by
exactly.
the way. Yeah.
There's a lot of sex in that painting. I mean, it's a Protestant culture.
Slippers,
so right, socks, red socks.
Right. Whoa.
Yeah.
This is a family event, Gary.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
let's keep it,
PG-13.
PG-13.
Yeah, okay. So it's great. And so looking at these Dutch paintings, you helped understand this foreign culture in which you had and that is the deceptive thing about the Netherlands. And I've spent a certain amount of time in the last decade in the Netherlands. One is seduced into thinking that yes, the Dutch are just like us. They're us Americans. That they're direct. They tell you exactly what they think and feel. It's essentially a Protestant culture with the same set of values. But of course, as you get to know the Dutch people and culture better, one understands that in fact there are very important differences, and that indeed we will always remain foreigners to the Dutch. So let's talk a little bit about that. What does it mean to be an expat in the Netherlands, and how has that affected your writing?
Well, I think if I had moved to India when I was 24 or 25, whatever, I would have been much more prepared for foreignness. If it's a culture that's quite close to your own, you kind of think, oh, I get this. Everybody speaks English, first of all, in Holland. Really, everybody. The culture, it looks quite familiar, and the people do the same kind of jobs. You know, there's like here in Rajasthan, you have a camel on the street. There's not a camel on the street in Amsterdam. You know, it looks exactly, I mean, physically it looks like a stage set, but if you go into people's homes, you see people who seem very, and so it's actually quite hard and it's quite upsetting to realize how different they are. And for me, what was fascinating and also very disturbing was to realize how much of my personality, which I'm putting in quotes, because when you come from a different culture and you become an expat, you realize that what you thought was your personality has nothing to do with you. It's totally given to you by your culture, by your family, by your religion, by your language, by your television programs, by your stupid politicians, by all this stuff creates 95% of who you are. And even in your language, you know that grammar imposes certain rules, right? I mean, if you speak Hindi, you know that the way you talk in Hindi is different from the way you talk in English. You're the same person, and so, but you're this different personality. And so it really forced me to actually ask questions about who I was, that if I had stayed in Houston, I think I would have not. I guess it would have been different.
Oh no, it definitely would have been different. There's no question about it. But I agree, and I've been an expat at different parts of my life as well, and there is that moment of realization when suddenly you realize how American you are and how inescapable it is.
It's like an accent. Like if you...
You can lose your accent.
With lots of work. Yeah. You realize the way you form words is so deep that it's, I mean, very...
Well, you can hear our Texan accent both, right? You can hear that coming through.
And you know, I can speak Dutch. I speak Dutch perfectly. I still have an American accent. Yeah. And unless I spend years making funny noises on a Zoom lesson with some real professional actor, I would probably never lose it. And so you do realize, like, am I even a person? Am I just this like mix of cultural things that were given to me?
Well, now we're getting into Michel Foucault and Pierre Bourdieu and whether or not we're, you know, is there free will or simply are we instruments for the dominant culture?
Well, I think there is. I mean, I think when you look at different artists' lives, what's so fascinating is you see that even though they are all coming from the same culture and often from the same cities, and even in Holland, we know if you look at a map of Amsterdam, you can see where the artists live. We know exactly what houses they lived in. So they lived on certain streets and in certain houses. And yet, they're very, very loudly different personalities. So maybe we do have some free will.
Well, let's find out. Let's ask the audience and to see if they have any questions for you, Benjamin.
They're coming around with microphones. Here's someone. Yeah.
Thank you for giving me this opportunity, sir. Well, my first question is, why hasn't there historically been an atheistic painting culture? And my second question is that in the modern times, now art has become a capitalistic investment, and this has led to people creating art that is solely created for the purpose of investment.
For the purpose of what?
The art is created solely for the purpose of investment.
Oh.
What is your opinion on modern art, and will there be a new modern Renaissance kind of a revolution in art?
Well, I mean, this is what's interesting. This is another thing that feels very close to where the Dutch were. They created art for the form of investment, as investment as well. They created, as I said, you know, if there was a market for landscapes, they liked your landscapes, then you would make more landscapes, and that was speculative often, but often it would be on commission, and there was always money involved. I think that when you get into the other thing that you might be talking about, which I love, I think, you have, what I write about in the book is late styles. So Rembrandt, late Rembrandt, he's fallen out of favor entirely. he is completely bankrupt and kind of forgotten by most of the people who used to patronize him. And he finds a kind of freedom in that. But it's almost a religious freedom. You know, this is where art verges into religious creation, when it's really just purely as an expression of one's soul. And this is quite rare, actually. I mean, you have to have some degree of expression of your soul, but too much of your soul, not always a good idea. You know what I mean? You have to kind of tamp it down a little bit in most cultures. I mean, if you, just because we're here, but if the Maharaj of Jaipur is the person who's giving, you have to make sure that he likes your stuff if you want to have a business. And the tension between money and art, I actually don't find, I mean, I think it's tempting to say now this is how it's become, but I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think it was always like that in most places and most times.
Well, there always has to be a patron. So, I mean, there are artists throughout history who have created things simply as an individual expression, but much of the art that we see in museums today was made specifically for a purpose, either in anticipating a purchaser or a patron or an institution that's acquiring it, or in service of a religion to decorate a temple, a shrine, or as a votive figure. So almost all art had a function that was different from personal expression of the artist. And I think that personal expression really is a modern phenomenon, and by modern I mean the last 600 years, 500, 600 years.
I see someone here as well.
Thanks for a wonderful talk. I loved what you said. I loved what you said about symbolism and the shoes by the bed being something to do with sex. I was wondering, what are some more symbols that one should look out for when they're looking at Dutch painting? Whether there's specific, a couple of basic things to just watch out for in that sense.
Well, in fact, the Dutch were great writers as well as painters, and so we do know a lot about what these things are supposed to mean. And there's certain painters that make a lot of jokes. It's often sexual stuff, on the one hand, if it's a comic painter. If it's a tragic painter, there's a lot of allusions to the Bible or to mythology. And there's a lot of kind of allusions. There's a famous painting that's actually not in my book, that's also by Metsu, who we mentioned, which is a mother with a sick child. And in fact, the way that the child is dressed and hanging sort of over this way, and the mother has a white skirt. Anyway, it makes two flags, actually. It's quite funny. You have the Dutch flag now, which is red, white, blue, in this order. But if you look at it on this side, it's orange, white, blue, which is an allusion to the House of Orange, and the dying child becomes a symbol of this dying dynasty, which actually is alive and well. They managed to pull through. But so those kind of things, it's lucky that we know this stuff, but if you don't, it does, what my book is a lot about is about learning that stuff, and learning that you can look at this painting and think it's a beautiful painting. Just like I can see a Rajasthani miniature and know nothing about it and just think it's pretty because it has nice colors. But the more you learn about any kind of art, it gives it a depth and an interest that I've found a fascinating thing to learn in my life.
They're going to bring the hook out, and we heard the alarm. So unfortunately, it's time for us to stop.
Well, thanks so much. Thanks, Gary.